Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the second session, shall I say, of the OR Tambo debate series, hosted by the Wits School of Governance. And in that regard, we'd like to acknowledge our host, Professor Thomas Mokgale, and our other hosts, the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. We have in our midst Natasha Ali and Samina Khan from the foundation. It's especially a good month for them because on the 27th of October, it's the birthday celebration of the late great O.R. Tambo, and they have a whole host of events lined up for the month, so this one comes particularly at a good time. Now, the purpose of these debates is movement. How do we move forward? A recognition that 16 years to deadline, we're still running against time. As we unpack action plans today, we want to know what do we do to fix our economy so that it creates jobs and allows us to care for the vulnerable in our society. Now, to help us connect the dots, we've distributed their bios, so I hope I will not have to go into detail about who they are. Some of them you know quite well. Is first off Professor Alex van der Heever. He is the Chair of Social Security for the Wits School of Governance. He has prepared a discussion document on achieving an inclusive society, creating synergies between social protection, the labor market, and economy. We'll be getting into that just now. The professor contends that South Africa presently lacks a purposive and integrated social and economic strategy, due largely to weaknesses with the conceptual framework and reinforced by flawed institutional platforms for policy development implementation. He will tell you more about that in a moment. And then we have our panelists, and that includes Iraj Abedian, who's the CEO for Pan African Capital Holdings. Welcome, Iraj.
Thank you.
Andrew Donaldson is the acting head for Government Technical Advisory Center. Welcome. Good evening. Trevor Ngwane, also no stranger to public discourse. He's the Social Change Research Chair at the University of the UJ. Welcome to you. We also have Miriam Altman. Miriam is the Commissioner for the National Planning Commission. I imagine that most of the questions will be coming your way tonight to find out how far you're going in terms of implementation. We also want to welcome Imran Valodia, who will be joining us on the panel soon. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management at the Wits University. I suppose for now then, let's call up Professor van der Heever to come and give us his paper.
Good evening. The purpose essentially of this talk that I will give is really to provide an introduction and to raise a number of issues for the panel to debate and discuss going forward. As pointed out, one of the purposes of the overall debate series and this particular discussion is not to get tied up in squabbles, whether they are of a policy nature or an ideological nature, but in order to productively debate things to go forward. So a large part of today's discussion is really moving forward. So this particular talk therefore provides a perspective to open debate on the strategies required to achieve an inclusive society through the consideration of synergies potentially between social protection, the labour market and the economy. As this is a sort of very brief input, the focus is strategic in nature and deals principally with the major directional choices facing the country and some of the open debates that require resolution at this level. So ongoing discussion will have to constructively resolve debates at both this and a more detailed level. So although the National Development Plan provides a valuable point of departure for discussion, in my view there is still a way to go, with much depending upon whether open debate is properly fostered, and a willingness to build a powerful consensus across society is seen as an important value, as central to the way forward as the values embedded within the proposed policies themselves. So quite simply, achieving an inclusive society also requires inclusive processes and processes which can also converge on solutions. Really to look into the issues, and to focus on them, if inequality and poverty were essential elements of accelerated economic growth and development, South Africa would be one of the most outstanding economic performers in the world. Instead, despite being at the forefront of the technological frontier in many sectors, South Africa manages to combine anemic economic growth with high structural unemployment and terrible socioeconomic outcomes, some of them directly attributable to the poor performance of government programs. So although a consensus exists that structural factors are inhibiting both economic growth and fairness, and the fairness of that growth, no general consensus exists on what these are, and therefore the policy measures that are needed to address them. So one influential position, which I refer to as the narrow growth path, argues that inequality and poverty are inevitable and even necessary to foster rapid economic growth, and which will always be somewhat harsh in the early phases of development. So achieving accelerated economic growth in this view implicitly requires inequality as a form of input, generating the incentives and flexibility needed at both the level of the sector and the firm to unlock the dynamic potential of the economy. An alternative view, which I refer to as the inclusive growth path, regards the prevalence of unemployment and inequality as an outcome of ongoing policy choices, which inhibit growth and development through externalizing many unmanageable risks onto individuals and families. So both growth and development are then affected by the resulting behavior of severely distressed families. In this view, poverty is regarded as an inevitable consequence of the modern economy, regardless of the country's level of development. So essentially, poverty is going to occur regardless of how developed or evolved an economy gets. It depends very much on what countermeasures are in place to counter them. So far from driving dynamic potential, the unconstrained social and economic pathologies in the modern economy can hinder rather than foster growth and development. So international comparisons indicate that the absence of redistributive programs, in the absence of them, poverty will settle at roughly 25 to 35% in all countries, regardless of their levels of development. So these rates are explicitly reduced to below 10% in those countries with mature social protection regimes and also ones which have essentially developed a degree of fairness in their society. So extreme poverty in South Africa, by way of contrast, is estimated at around about 32.4%, with poverty estimated at between 50 and 55%, over more general poverty. So furthermore, South Africa's stunting rate of children is an alarming 24%, which implies that 24% of South Africa's children have compromised cognitive capabilities from youth. The question to ask is whether this poverty outcome is in fact a policy choice, and a bad choice at that. So if the narrow growth path view is accepted, that inequality and poverty are transitional concerns to be addressed fully only when levels of development cross some undefined threshold, then comprehensive policy responses, apart from residual strategies focused narrowly on the most egregious social concerns, can actually be deferred indefinitely. Structural interventions to alleviate poverty through redistributive and risk-sharing programs of various forms are, in this view, argued to become possible only when improved fiscal space arising from economic growth permits. So programs to remove poverty and inequality in this view take on the form of a luxury good, purchasable in quantity and scale only when aggregate incomes are very high. So social protection, far from being regarded as an input into the economic development process, is instead seen as a beneficial consequence of adequate growth. So the inclusive growth path view, however, argues alternatively that poverty and inequality are a consequence of how society is organized and not the outcome of a particular level of development. The modern economy, in this view, externalizes many destructive social harms that cannot be countered without concerted action of some form or another. So these externalized factors include complex risks that are transferred to families, such as unemployment, old age, healthcare needs and their financial consequences, childcare, and the death and disability of a breadwinner. It also includes market power imbalances and the determination and protection of disposable incomes and conditions of employment. Gatekeepers, essentially, to the remuneration and determination of incomes and also particular sectors can have a huge impact on the distribution of income. And it also includes complex labour market activities such as education, skills development, job search, and access to justice, which will be very important, which, if not managed, are huge risks that individual families have to manage on their own. So well-organized societies seek to internalize these externalities rather than to exploit their avoidance as some form of temporary market advantage. So the NDP appears to adopt a version of the narrow growth path, arguing that South Africa's social pathologies derive from the socioeconomic distortions of apartheid, which constrained the development of skills of the vast majority of the population and kept them trapped in poverty. So the section of the report, Conceptual Framework for Social Protection, consequently headlines with a statement that employment creation is the most effective form of social protection. So the NDP therefore gives priority to addressing socioeconomic factors leading to differential capability development as the means to alter the differential access to labour markets and remuneration. But the rapidly deepening inequality that's occurred after 1994, despite increased investments in capability development, is, however, not investigated by the NDP. The trends, however, suggest that the distribution of income is potentially dominated by factors unrelated to capabilities in this period and the productivity of labour. So income inequality is in fact moving in the opposite direction to capability investments. So high rates of unemployment also cannot be simply attributed to factors such as labour market inflexibility, as is often argued, as according to the OECD, South Africa ranks fairly low, in fact lower than both India and China, on its protections for both regular and temporary employment. So if it is assumed that economic rewards are distributed in accordance with capabilities, inequality should have declined slightly, or at the very least remained flat from 1994. Instead, South Africa exhibits arguably the most unequal top income structure in the world, with the top 5% of income earners receiving around 40% of all income, that is before tax, a position structurally worse than during apartheid, which was around 35% during the periods of greatest inequality. It is worth noting that the top 5% of income earners in countries such as Malaysia and Sweden earn less than 20% of total income. So the alternative interpretation of South Africa's social and economic trends, consistent with the inclusive growth path view, therefore argues that the distribution of income in South Africa is a potential leading causal factor driving the adverse economic outcomes, such as unemployment and slow growth, rather than the compromised capabilities. Without diminishing the importance of ongoing programs to address capabilities, this view suggests that policy imperatives require an elevated priority for measures to address structural failures in the distribution of income. So South Africa's social and economic history strongly suggests that narrow rather than inclusive growth strategies have been pursued, both before and subsequent to the democratic transition. So this is not to say that human, social, and economic development has been absent, but rather that what has been implemented has not been sufficient to counter the inevitable harmful tendencies of the modern economy. So many risks associated with the conduct of economic activities have been externalized onto the vulnerable implicitly as a trade-off for economic productivity and increased competitiveness. So this has been permitted through a poorly organized and developed social security and protection system. The protected transfer, and as well as the protected transfer of incomes to privileged groups and sectors, and weak labour market protections, and potentially poorly designed labour market protections, and a poorly performing government sector which prioritizes patronage over delivery, undermining capability development. So although the NDP clearly identifies many distributional concerns, it does so within the context of a conceptual approach that sees inequality and unemployment as the outcome of apartheid-induced human capability gaps. While these gaps are most definitely present, the danger inherent in this approach is the implicit deprioritization of strategies with explicit distributional goals in favor of programs that at best passively impact on inequality, poverty, and unemployment, and at worst are totally drowned out by distributional factors. So bolder and more integrated approaches are potentially needed that combine substantial social protection, capability development, and labour activation at a scale sufficient to reconfigure structural deficiencies in the distribution of income and manage all material social risks. So although it may be argued that adopting a program of this nature at scale involves unforeseen risks, the narrow growth approach, which has arguably been in place both before and after 1994, involves risks that are now well known and predictable. So continuing on the post-1994 trajectory may therefore send South Africa on a path to levels of inequality never before experienced in this country, with unknown and political and economic consequences. So the options going forward consequently need to be considered with great care, especially as the default strategy, which involves doing nothing or a bit more of the same, is all that is required to structurally deepen inequality and poverty. So hopefully that sets the scene for hopefully a deep discussion on the issues, focusing really on where we need to go and what in fact technically are the structural impediments to South Africa's development going forward. And it means that there is both an argument in relation to the diagnostic as well as to the policies themselves, which are not trivial. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.